Community leaders, politicians, and friends and family gathered in Boston yesterday to honor the city's first black female TV reporter, Dr. Sarah Ann Shaw, who died Thursday at 90 years old.
I wouldn't be where I am today if Miss Shaw had not made time for me. She took me under her wing. And I know I am one of generations who are where they are today because of the example that she set.
In 1968, Shaw became part of the team behind GBH's Say Brother, now known as Basic Black. She went on to a 3-decades-long career at WBZ-TV, which started at the height of the civil rights movement and Boston's busing crisis. In that time, she became known for her compassionate storytelling and her efforts to blaze a trail for the next generation of journalists. Former GBH Vice President of Programming Marita Rivero worked with Shaw for years on Say Brother. And the new publisher of the Bay State Banner, Ron Mitchell, worked with Shaw for much of her time at WBZ-TV. Ron, tell us a little bit about Shaw.
Well, Sarah Ann Shaw was an icon, but a quiet, gentle giant, I will say. Her demeanor was always calm and direct, but she had a tenor underneath that of strength. And she would go and talk truth to power. Many executives and news executives in the newsrooms at that time were really trying to search for ratings. And it was an easy, low lift in the news business to go to that community to talk about the crime or whatever, negative images. If it bleeds, it leads was the tempo back then. But Sarah wasn't having it. She would go and tell the news directors, no, there's other stories here. You have to tell the positive. You have to tell the truth about our community. And she held them accountable and really forged the way for many of us in the industry.
And Marita, when you think of Dr. Shaw, what's your first memory that springs to mind?
I think she's fun. She was easy to approach. People did approach her. She responded to them. She was part of the community. I loved it that she taught kind of all of us that you need to be part of the community, part of the larger community, not just be your job. So she was out in the street. She was available. She had a lot of stories because she knew the people.
And so she had a real legacy on coverage here. So when she spoke about, we have some tape of her speaking about Basic Black's coverage of stories versus other news stations and her hopes about them.
The fact that there's so many things that have repeated and have repeated and repeated. And I want to live long enough to see us to be able to do things that have more staying power. I'd like to know how those like me with this gray hair, how can we communicate to a younger group some of the things we did so they can avoid some of the mistakes and do some other kinds of things that produce some activities that make you say, wow, yeah.
So when she set out to do that, how far do you think she went to achieve that goal?
Oh, my goodness. She was a long-term member of the League of Women for Community Service, which was founded in 1918 in Boston. And over the years, more younger people started coming through that. And she hung in there. She kept saying, wait a minute, where are they? Let's keep bringing them in. She worked with the Boston area, it was Boston Association of Black Journalists, which we founded before the National Association, which put her in touch with people younger than she was, but coming along, it created a structure in which she could really talk to people. And in later years, she just said, Marita, I've got to get out there. She was very concerned about how she could reach people. Of course, she had people in her own family who were younger. And I think she underestimated, really, how many young people she was able to meet because she was available to them. She wasn't always telling people, this is what you need to do. This is what's wrong with what you're doing. This is how we did it. She really approached people from the point of view that we could all have a conversation. I want to learn from you. And I want to bring more of myself to you than just, I was at this, I was at that, I was the other. I think she was very successful at that.
And if there's any one or handful of lessons that you take from her career for people in the business now, what would they be?
Well, she was a great listener. She was like your mom. For me, she was one person who would sit and she would listen to you.
My mom would be thrilled to hear that she's a great listener.
Yeah. She would listen to you. She would take the time. And I think the best reporters did that. They respected everybody they talked to, and you could feel that in how they communicated with you. But they would also intelligently guide you, and say, well, you might want to look at it this way, or you might, and keep in mind. And then normally by the end of the conversation, if there was something that she wanted you to learn, you would be like, oh, wow, okay, because the way she approached you was such a loving way and such such a respectful way. And I think that that's what made her so successful in getting great stories told, and why she was so persuasive, and how she taught, not just video journalists like myself, but other journalists she worked with and other producers in the business, because TV definitely started as being reporter-driven. But by the time the 2000s happened, and then even the 90s when she was really in her heyday, it was a lot more producer-driven. But again, she went and she didn't allow them to guide the news when it came to her stories. They were her stories. They were stories about real people, real things that mattered. And she made sure they understood that. And it wasn't going to be boiled down to the most dramatic angle to get ratings. It was the truth. It mattered. This was her community. She was of the community. And she was going to make sure that everybody felt that, understood that. And her love came through in her journalism. It was just, you know, she was a remarkable woman.
When she looked back at her career, do you think there was a particular story that she would highlight as sort of, this was my favorite, as like a moment?
I don't know about the story. I just like to think of her courage in approaching whatever story it was, which lets you come back and say, I could do that. I could take that on. I didn't work with her every day. I remember her from Say Brother, the early days when she was with Henry Hampton and Eyes on the Prize, Henry Hampton, and Stan Lathan, who now works with Chris Rock, and really a stellar group, and she was a host. She just stepped into that job out of being a community activist, and, you know, someone said, we think you could be a part-time host, and she took that on. So I think her courage demonstrated itself in many ways. Her core allowed her to speak back. It allowed her to champion issues other people thought weren't really worth our time. And it allowed her to take on issues and work that it might have been easier to just let go. So as a model for those of us coming along, she was brilliant. She was brilliant. And I appreciate that about her.
Yeah, and I think the thing that people need to understand the most about, when she became a reporter, you know, society was going through the serious civil rights movement of our century, of the last century, you know, and as a young black man growing up, I was under scrutiny. And the whole society and media vilifying and making everything that happens to the black community negative put me in danger, you know, and made me feel less than. And as a reporter, she understood that because she was from the community, and she wasn't going to allow that misrepresentation of our community to continually affect us as a people. So she educated the folks who controlled the media through her stories and through going in the office. And once she left the station, I went and fought for many stories, and I would have never done it if I didn't learn from her how to do that. I was a photographer. Photographers didn't motivate stories. But once I realized I could and I knew how to do it, I followed her lead, and even after she was gone, I still continued that legacy. And many of us in the news business who learned from her continued that legacy to make sure we told the truth about our community. And I wouldn't be publisher and owner of the Bay State Banner if it wasn't for understanding the importance and how it affects our community. Her legacy lives on in me and many of the other journalists who are still out there.
And in our bosses. She taught the executives that there was a story here. I think that was, she wasn't just us she was teaching. She was teaching the people who'd hired her.
And it's striking how important that her example was, not just within journalism, but to people who were affected by it. So we had the Reverend Marina White Hammond discussing Shaw's importance to her and her dedication to uplifting stories of Bostonians at the memorial yesterday.
It was really important to see someone who looked like me out there covering the news. She was also trying to shape what kinds of stories were covered and the perspective of how those stories were covered. I remember her telling me that one of her big battles was to make sure that when they lifted up Roxbury, it wasn't just always for negative things. She knew you had to cover when we lost somebody because of a shooting, but you also needed to cover when a library was open, and you also needed to cover when our young people were winning in the state championships. And she made sure that there was the kind of even coverage that painted a picture of our community that, to be honest with you, you didn't see on every station.
Marita, any last words about her?
Well, it's one thing to be a first, and she was the first, but everyone always says they want to see people behind them. And I think what we're hearing is that there's a long, long line of people standing behind her whom she brought along. She opened the door for, she mentored, and she grew.
It sounds like she's someone who left a long legacy behind her of people who grew and are stronger because of her, and we'll remember her for that. Marita Rivero, Ron Mitchell, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.